Were the buildings at the Chicago World's Fair temporary? It may be the biggest question mark that this event proposes to those who view these impressive structures. Were they purely wood, staff, and plaster, or are they iron, brick, and stone? Strangely enough, there are strong pictorial and written evidences for both ends of the spectrum, so let's explore it. We are going to take a tour of sorts through the event and visit various buildings, exploring the construction materials used and a few other details of note. We may potentially point out some inconsistencies in imagery and descriptions as well. So thank you for joining me for another exploration of the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Let's begin. Starting off with a brief recap by showing the small section describing in the main set of structures that will be presented at this event. Now, remember, this document was prepared without accurate data and considered hypothetical, being put forward in November of 1890, which is 3 months before the first shovel broke ground in Jackson Park. The plans state, this group of buildings, namely the administration, the machinery, the manufacturers, the mining, and the electric, are to form a whole in design. They are intended as a mass to be impressive, as a plan most convenient, and as structures to be very substantial. The materials entering into their composition will be largely iron and masonry of brick and stone, though a free use will be made of terracotta, woodstuff, and other materials. On the contrary, we have a section from the Inland Architect and News Record, specifically Volume 17. This publication is a monthly journal devoted to architecture, construction, decoration, and furnishings in the West, and is dated for 1891. The majority of the buildings will be built of staff and either iron or wood. Staff, so called, is a light composite, fireproof material, comparatively inexpensive, capable of presenting a general appearance of stone, of being cast in ornamental molds, and being colored in any desired manner. The cost of the buildings erected in this way will be from 30 to 50% less than their cost in stone or brick. Although the designs for the more important of the exhibition buildings have been approved by the committee, they have not yet been displayed to the public. So keep note of these various materials being mentioned as we go through various structures. Starting at the administration building, let's review our general plans for the exposition that were shared in previous episodes. It states the following. The administration building is to cover many functions, among them that of a station for all transportation lines entering the park, a station more extensive than any now existing. It will also contain the full administration forces for information, for police, fire, transportation, public comfort, expenditure, and accounts, and any other similar purposes. It is therefore headquarters where nearly all visitors will arrive, attend to any business that they may have, and depart. And here all forces and employees report and take their orders. It should be the most important in architectural appearance, and of necessity, well constructed and fireproof. This next section is from a publication called Art Souvenir, World's Columbian Exposition and Views of Chicago. We have mentioned that the administration building is constructed of a material to last a couple of years, yet not necessarily indicating what that material is specifically. Moving on to the next description, which is from a book called The Authentic Portfolio of the World's Columbian Exposition. And before checking this document, a quick note to keep track of is the amount of times any dimensions of these buildings are mentioned versus the actual materials used in construction or what the building is made of. Additionally, there's often a mention of cost either for the entire building or certain sections, annexes, or additional beautification. Keep that idea in mind as we continue our trip around the fair's buildings. So we have the measurements of the acreage or building footprint, the height of the outer dome and the inner dome, the diameter of the dome, the 4 pavilions and their dimensions. The entrances are calculated and impressively large at that. Also measuring the promenade gallery, including a measurement from the ground, another measurement for the base of the dome and the dome proper, naturally, and then the cost. And here, this is what we're looking for. Material, 3.25 million feet of lumber and 1,563,607 pounds of structural steel. Then back into some more measurements of the 4 pavilions. We also have a calculation for the rotunda, the open colonnade, and the columns in near proximity. Reading the next detail, the interior of this magnificent structure will exceed in beauty and splendor that of the exterior. We then have the hall dimensions after this, and additionally we have mention of swiftly moving elevators, and also that this dome just happens to be one of the largest of its kind in the world. Add that to the list. So as we assess this information, it is curious why roughly 2/3 of this explanation was purely measurements. Yet one sentence mentioned materials, a rough number in the millions with feet of lumber and pounds of steel. Regardless, it is still a substantial amount of material. Now let's take a few notes from the history of the World's Fair. The first note here is at the top. Were it stone instead of imitation, it would have no equal. Certainly an interesting comment. A few other ones from this section on the administration building. The initial few sentences were quite interesting, and they read as follows. When a person drops a ticket for which he has paid 50 cents into the box at any of the exposition turnstiles and enters upon the spectacular grounds dedicated to the memory of the discoverer of America, he beholds what has taken 10,000 workmen more than 2 years and $32 millions to accomplish. He may ask himself whether all this expenditure was worthwhile. He may as well ask himself whether it was worthwhile for Columbus to have discovered America. A written guardrail of sorts for the reader who dare question the endeavors of the exposition company, spending millions to build a temporary city to showcase the world's treasures, advancements, and technologies, to then get demolished or set ablaze, are absolutely no grounds to ask questions, it seems. For you might as well question the entire narrative of Columbus, which is also very interesting. Is this a red herring statement or argument? A completely illogical redirection of thought to alter the reader's perception? Something to consider there. Next, a few notes here that felt relevant to mention of just how magnificent and grand the White City is as a whole. Its buildings are more imposing, and its gardens and lagoons more beautiful than any imagination had pictured them. I had no conception of the extent, variety, or splendor of these buildings. Is the exclamation mental or verbal of every visitor when he enters the park? The appearance of the magnificent group of main buildings around the lagoons is so different from anything in the United States, is so un-American that it startle the imagination. Additionally, we have a note of how the architecture, in its infinite detail, must truly be seen to be appreciated. Could this be why they are no longer there? Moving on, we have mention of the size and cost of these main buildings, along with the thought, care, and labor which they represent. Reading this last section regarding the dome of the administration building, there is no dome in this country to which this one can be compared. It is finer in every respect than any other on the Western Hemisphere. From here we get into costs and some more measurements. On the next page we read a section about the entrances. In the rear of these arches are the entrance doors, and above them great screens of glass giving light to the central rotunda. Indeed, an interesting detail. Have we seen mention of glass being a construction material thus far? The size of this glass, how much, how it was put into place. This is also a detail that can be seen in the image of the Columbus statue in earlier episodes. And let's not forget, the interior of this building exceeds in beauty and splendor even the exterior, imposing as that is, which is truly an incredible statement. We can merely grasp at the splendor with a select few images which were taken by Charles Dudley Arnold, who was the official photographer of this event. He was referred to as Arnold in the previous episode, as I did not know the full name at the time, and am essentially learning along with you. From here we have two more sections of note. The first is describing the coloring of various sections or details within the building, and it reads as follows. The Corinthian columns to the lower portion of the frieze beneath the mezzanine story have been painted a warm yellow. This, however, is but the body color, as the columns are finished in imitation onyx. Moving on to this last paragraph, it mentions the thousands of incandescent lights that would illuminate the fusion of harmonious colors and tints. It seems to be describing the coloring of the building. If there were actual colored lights of glass that caused this effect, that would seem to add more obscurity to the official story, it seems. Lastly, were the administration building stone instead of imitation, it would have no equal in the world. So let's round this building off with some additional questions. We have many mentions of measurements, almost to nauseam. Was this merely to indicate how impressive this building was? Potentially creative writing, let's say. Maybe a form of misdirection to drown the reader with data that can't quite be quantified unless you were there observing this building. How about the lack of any mention of glass to be used within this building? Was it simply a minuscule amount in comparison to other buildings, and therefore not worthy of mention? A question that always arises with this event is the construction of the interiors. There certainly was none for the administration building, at least none that I could uncover thus far. Where is that documentation? If these interiors are even more impressive than the exterior, why do we not have more than a handful of photos for the interior of this building? What about the mention of imitation onyx? An interesting comment, and it could simply be imitation created through staff or possibly Scagliola, which will be discussed later on. Keep that one in mind. Or is this a potential clue of what may have actually been there? Another interesting piece of info is that the dome of this structure was similar to the Roman Pantheon, where the skylight is open to the elements. Now, I do not have the specific source and rarely like to make claims without some sort of reference. However, it was mentioned in one of the various books in my archives, so take that with a grain of salt. Before moving on, there was this curious set of information regarding companies used for various construction services for this specific building. This section from Campbell's Illustrated History states the type of work completed, along with the contractor associated with it. Alas, here is a lead. So I invite anyone interested to do some digging. Do these companies still exist? Are there references, photos, histories of these projects in their archives? This is an essential piece of evidence here. There is still work to be done. So let me know in the comments what you find should you be curious enough to investigate. Now, moving on to our next structure, the agricultural building. One that is continuously mentioned through various publications, like the authentic portfolio of the world's Columbian Exposition, that such a building was never before erected at any exposition, and its construction shows that every facility is being given to aid the livestock and agricultural interests. Earlier in this explanation, we have mention of a mammoth glass dome also. This is again mentioned in Martin's World's Fair album, and reads as follows. This is surmounted by a mammoth glass dome, 130 feet high. We then have a note from the history of the World's Fair. It reads as follows. In its construction, there were used 2 million pounds of structural steel and 9.5 million feet of lumber, including the 2 million in its annexes. Later in this section, we have another mention of the 100-foot diameter rotunda, which is surmounted by a great glass dome. As a quick note of mention, as seen with this short description from the Art Souvenir World's Columbian Exposition and views of Chicago, we rarely have mention of construction materials from many publications, yet always have measurements of some kind, which is simply a curious detail. Next, from Campbell's Illustrated History, we have various sections throughout this publication that provide updates on the progress of the exposition and the buildings. This update on the agricultural building reads as follows. Interior columns and gallery girders and joists in position, and the great iron columns supporting the roof being placed. Of the 7 million feet of lumber which the building will contain, more than half is already utilized. Note the amount of 7 million feet of lumber, which is more than double the administration building. No mention of glass, though. Moving on, we have an interesting detail in the journal previously mentioned. There may be more details such as this in these journals, and it merely requires time to read the entries. According to this section, the agricultural building is to be largely iron and stone in a decorated style of classic work, and its annexes of simple, inexpensive form, extending along the lake and also directly back towards the stock show. Further along, we have this section which states, the machinery building is to be of the same type of architecture, as will all buildings surrounding the court, and it is to have annexes enclosed by the railroad loop and entered by subways. Now, this section could be merely referencing particular architectural aspects of these buildings being similar. In many cases, they were, and it is visibly evident. Yet these buildings are all labeled or classified with distinct styles and various descriptions. Could it be possible that this is a subtle nod indicating that the machinery building and all buildings surrounding the main court or basin are largely iron and stone? That is, of course, up to you to decide. And as you ponder that question, here are the contractors for the agricultural building to research and comment below with your findings. Our next stop is the machinery building. Checking back in with Martin and their souvenir booklet, the first note is the architects, Peabody and Stearns of Boston, which is another thread or another line of research to dig into. The next note is the mention of the massive arched trusses used in construction. Reading further, the trusses are built separately so that they can be taken down and sold for use as railroad train houses. So this is one of the few mentions of materials being built to be reused for another purpose. Now, this is the type of detail we should expect to read continuously in these documents. The multi-purpose aspects of an event that was stated to be temporary. The recycling of materials, especially the mass amount of steel that is being used. Our last note is that the exterior of the building is in staff, colored. This is our first mention of staff being implemented on a specific building. The previous mention was in the architectural journal that indicated most buildings will have this treatment. Now, that isn't even the most important detail. The last word is colored. This implies the use of pigments to add coloring to the neutral tone of staff. So keep this detail in mind as it will be discussed later on. Here we have a brief mention of the materials used in the machinery hall from the authentic portfolio of the world's Columbian Exposition. Only wood and steel mentioned in feet and pounds, respectively. No mention of glass, ornamentation material, or exterior material. Moving on, we have a brief description in Campbell's Illustrated History of work completed on this specific building. Floor and 6,000 supporting piers completed. Superstructure going up, and foundation for annex being laid. Unsure if that is 6,000 interior piers, or if that is wooden piles as discussed in the previous video. No mention of brick either in the foundation of the annex. Unusual. An honorable mention here with the publication called The History of the Fair, as it includes a massive section regarding the machinery hall. There was not any mention of materials, yet if anyone is interested in the inner workings of these machines and the workings of the fair, this section would be a primary resource. It is simply impossible to include every detail into one presentation, and much of what is discussed in this section would have been excellent to include in the previous episode regarding services and infrastructure. If that interests you, it is linked below for further investigation. Another note with that in mind is the amount of machinery that is mentioned through this section. There is a mention of that here. The entire Alice combination of iron and steel weighs more than 225 tons. Its wheel and shaft alone weigh more than 100 tons. The flywheel is 30 feet in diameter. Now, details such as this are quite interesting, and maybe this is quite subjective. Yet this detail seems vaguely open-ended. So this metal and steel machine weighed more than 225 tons. So like 226 tons or 700 tons. Again, maybe this is being too picky, yet it seems like something that would be known, would it not? Would it not be beneficial to know the weight of this type of machinery? Regardless if it's in pieces, the weight would be important to know for production, for shipping, for moving into place. And what about the foundation of this machine? What would 225 plus tons of steel and metal be placed on? There were hundreds of machines, ranging in size, type, and weight, for various purposes. The machinery hall, which will be larger than any before built, will not only cover machinery in the ordinary sense, but will furnish a great central open space spanned with wide trusses, where there shall be the best chance possible for the display of the different transportation exhibits. Railway tracks are to be laid in all passages and covered with the floors when not in use, so that heavy machinery may be moved about at will. These railway tracks are to lead out upon the main lines in the grounds, so that locomotives and cars may enter and depart without delay. Powerhouses and heating plants will be made in connection with this building. This section sourced from the general plans for the exposition in Campbell's Illustrated History. Unsure if this was done, however, it would make much more sense to build railroad tracks into buildings, or at least strategic points around buildings, in order to transport exhibitors and their display, along with materials. Some displays being so incredibly grand. Does this cause a disconnect in simply how much stuff is here versus the time frame to inform various companies and countries to prepare, package, rail or shipping across seas, receiving, storing, setting up, cleaning, revising any aspects due to broken inventory? There are simply many instances of logistics that, if nothing else, require time. However, I will leave that one there with you, and it will most likely be explored in another episode. Let's get back on track with our next stop, which is the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, the largest building at this exposition and also in the world in terms of its volume and footprint. Its unequaled size makes it one of the architectural wonders of the world. We have mention of the materials used, along with a few extra details. We have 17 million feet of lumber and 12 million pounds of steel in trusses of central hall, 2 million pounds of iron in roof of nave. Some extraordinary numbers here. 11 acres of skylights. It simply boggles the mind. Yet there are no images of transportation of this glass, no images showing the moving of this glass into place, or installation of this glass, which is curious to say the least. Our next section refers to the exterior of the building, which is covered with staff, which is treated to represent marble. The huge fluted columns and the immense arches are apparently of this beautiful material. Here again, we have another mention of staff being used and treated to represent marble. Keep note of these details. How about the use of the word apparently in the next sentence? Columns and arches are apparently of this beautiful material. So, is it or is it not? We have these unusual instances where some details of particular buildings are so precise and numerous, yet others are quite vague and simply not good enough. So we can relay the dimensions of the height of the walls, height of pavilions, height of the corner pavilions, height of the roof and central hall, height of trusses used, height from the floor, the span of the truss, span in the clear, width of the truss at base, at hip, and at the apex, the weight of the truss, with purlines, and the total acreage of the building as well. Yet when it comes to the exterior of the building, we get a few lines of, well, yes, these details are apparently of this material. How do we not know that information? Now how about this? If we are simply to accept the use of the word apparently, what are we to make of an image and caption such as this from the publication Photographs of the World's Fair? The many artistic bridges, the numerous canals, banked by walls of apparently solid marble, from the very margins of which rise the stately facades of the handsome white city structures, cannot fail to occupy the mind with ideas of Venice. Are these not peculiar descriptions? Anyways, that is another one for you to ponder. Lastly, we have our contractors. We don't seem to have a specific contractor designated for glass though, unless it would be under exterior covering. That's unknown. Moving on to the Illinois building. Our initial mention here is that the North Memorial Hall will be fireproof. An interesting detail to mention specifically within such a small description. Additionally, we have mention of this building in Campbell's Illustrated History. Let's read over a few sections here. The structure is on a terrace 4 or 5 feet high, and in front of the entrances are stone terraces, with railings, statues, and stone steps leading down to the roadway. The building is embellished with fine carving and statuary. Our next note relates to an upcoming image, so keep this one in mind. There are 3 entrances, the prominent one to the south. Lastly, we have mention of our building materials. The building is constructed of Illinois stone, brick, and steel covered with staff. Also, we have another similar mention of the materials used in Shep's World's Fair photographed. Here, it states, the material used in the building is Illinois stone, brick, and steel, and the design followed is severely classical. The statues are made of carefully prepared blocks. Lastly, let's review an image from the book Photographs of the World's Fair. It depicts a statue in front of the Illinois building, labeled as Blind Man's Bluff, and states that this statue stands in the exposition grounds near the south entrance of the Illinois State Building. So we read earlier that the south entrance was indeed the main entrance. Now draw your attention to the path surrounding this statue. It is entirely laid with stone, a stone pathway. A very curious detail indeed. The statue in the background appears to be missing, with a pile of rubble around the base as well. An oddity to add is that we do not have a list of contractors as with many of the other buildings. No mention of glass also. There was mention of skylights and many windows, yet no mention of glass as a construction material as with some other descriptions. So these are the details we need to keep in mind, as we have many theories stating that all buildings were temporary. And up to this point, we have many structures that have indicated in primary source documents detailing temporary materials. This is true. Yet all evidences viewed here for this building strongly suggest that there was nothing temporary about the Illinois building. The most anomalous aspect of this would be the fact that this building no longer exists. It was disappeared. And as always, that is for you to decipher. So let's move on to our next building, which was hinted at in the last episode, the U.S. Government Building. Let's take a look at our first description from the Art Souvenir World's Columbian Exposition. It reads as follows. The building is of iron, brick, and glass, and classic in design. Next is a description from the authentic portfolio of the World's Columbian Exposition. It relays this description for materials: 4 million feet of lumber and 1.8 million pounds of iron. Additionally, we have a note from Martin's World Fair album, and it mentions that the government building covers an area of 350 by 420 feet, is constructed of iron, brick, and glass, and cost $400,000. Then, of course, our description mentioned in the last video from the World's Fair album. It is built solidly of brick, iron, and glass, thus being practically fireproof. A very interesting assortment of descriptions, with a few varying construction materials. However, as with the Illinois building, we seem to have another structure that is far from temporary being mentioned in these publications. Moving on to the mines and mining building, we have a few notes here of mention. The first coming from a book called Plans and Diagrams of All Exhibit Buildings in the World's Columbian Exposition. We read the following section. These loggias on the first floor are faced with marbles of different kinds and hues, which will be considered part of the mining exhibit, and so utilized as to have marketable value at the close of the exposition. The loggia ceilings are heavily coffered and richly decorated in plaster and color, The ornamentation is masked at the prominent points of the facade. Our next data point is from the Authentic Portfolio document and reads as follows. A great portion of the roof is covered with glass. The cantilever system is used to support the roof, and the mines and mining building is the only one excepting in the dome, using steel trusses to support the roof. There was not much else in regards to the mines and mining building within the documents researched for this presentation. However, at the end of these buildings will be presented an overview from another document that contains rough materials for all buildings discussed. One last addition here is our contractors for this specific building. Let's move on to the Horticultural Building. A few interesting notes with this one. The first one is from our Art Souvenir publication, which states the following. The exterior of the building is in staff or stucco, tinted a soft, warm buff, color being reserved for the interior and the courts. Next edition is from the plans and diagrams of all exhibit buildings, where we have a few notes. Let's begin with this one. The center of the pavilion is roofed by a crystal dome 187 feet in diameter and 113 feet high, under which are exhibited the tallest palms, bamboos, and tree ferns that can be procured. Those exhibits requiring sunshine and light are shown in the front curtains, where the roof is entirely of glass. The exterior of the building is in staff, tinted in cream. An interesting point to note is the word staff, or the material used, is in quotations. Now this will be important in the coming sections of the presentation, so keep these little details in the back of your mind. Our final note for the Horticultural Building will be a section pulled from the Architectural Journal, referenced previously. We are going to read through the majority of this section as these are noteworthy details. I hand you herewith the plan of grounds adopted by Commission, with the final revised plans and an estimate of acreage in buildings. Upon more mature study, it was found desirable to condense, and some of the buildings have been made smaller, with the expectation that whatever additional room is needed will be secured by inexpensive annexes to be built as space is demanded. Spaces between buildings also have been somewhat reduced, and the forms originally given to several of them have been changed to better utilize the area devoted to them. The Horticultural Building is moved from the north end of the park to a position corresponding with that of the Agricultural Building on the original plat, which has been moved to a more direct relation to livestock and given a position on the Grand Court. Further along, we read that some of the buildings and entrances, including the agriculture, livestock, and machinery, have been given more room by pushing all the buildings further north and getting more compact arrangements. This has been accepted as a great improvement over the old arrangement. Preliminary plans for the 9 principal buildings of the exposition have been prepared by the several architects and are now being completed and conformed to the suggested modifications, which further study and the added professional skill of the Commission of Architects have brought about. So let's ask some questions here. This document is dated for February 27th, 1891. The moving of earth has already begun, yet entire areas, annexes, spaces in between buildings, and at one point all buildings were moved further north. We have here an indication in a journal specifically geared towards architectural news and updates that states this entire plan is still not finalized, still being changed. And I will venture out on a limb here and say to move entire buildings and shift their plans along with this is no small operation. Considering our last episode of the infrastructure, just imagine the amount of things that would require alteration. It's almost mind-boggling. I mean, let's run through even just some of the modifications that would be required. Initially, the moving of earth, piles and pile driving, the infrastructure subways, which include everything mentioned in the previous episode: water, sewage, electrical, drainage, the changing of exhibits, modification of building materials for almost every notable building. And surely there are many more. This is an extraordinary ask, yet it was simply accepted and stated that it was a better solution. This seems like something you would not be doing in February of 1891, when this event is scheduled to open in May of 1893. Is this common with events today? Regardless, it is an incredibly curious set of data points, almost bordering on the line of anomalous. Let's also add our list of contractors for this building for further lines of research. Moving on to the electrical building, or is it the electricity building? Now, this is interesting. We have multiple documents with different titles of this building. Before getting to those, let's go through a quick note here, which reads as follows. It will be built of a material resembling granite in color. No further details, which is a little unusual, and even the exterior detail that is provided is quite vague. Let's continue on to these next couple of documents that strangely title the building differently. Yet they have the exact same passage in regards to some building materials. Yet again, another note to keep track of, as this will be discussed in an upcoming episode regarding the mass media surrounding this event. You may even need to start keeping a notebook handy while watching these presentations. This simply indicates that this topic is incredibly vast, intricately detailed in some respects, vague in others, and overall a very obscured exposition. Let's read our identical passage. The appearance of the building is that of marble, but the walls of the hemicycle and of the various porticos and loggia are highly enriched with color, the pilasters in these places being enriched with scagliola, and the capitals with metallic effects in bronze. A very interesting set of information which strangely could be considered contradicting. We have one mention that elements will resemble granite, while others that state a marble-like appearance. Another note here to keep in mind is the term scagliola. It is another material similar to plaster, staff, or stucco that has been repeatedly used at this World's Fair. Again, let's show our list of contractors who were tasked with the completion of this building. The next building we will look at is the Art Palace, or building, which is the only remaining structure on the grounds today. One of the few buildings mentioned throughout this event that was being built to last, or at least out of durable materials. We are told this is the case for insurance purposes, as it housed some of the most priceless pieces of art shown at the exposition. We are going to view a few pictures selected from Charles D. Arnold's collection, which showcase some interesting views of the art building. Our first image is showing the building with various materials strewn about on the ground. We see what appears to be molds of siding, which would indicate the stucco, staff, or scagliola style of construction, at least for the exterior. One of the strangest aspects of this image seems to be that the majority of the middle portion of this structure seems complete. We have detailed pillars in place, along with inlays completed, all molds in place above the entrance, yet the rotunda is still being completed. Additionally, the foundation section of this building is exposed. Suppose it is just curious why some sections of this building look completely finished, in different areas. Is it possible that this was an incredibly rushed job and maybe certain sections of workers were more efficient than others? Maybe there is a logical explanation for completing these specific sections in the order we see presented visually. Let's move on to our next image. Again, the art building in its initial construction phases. We can see that these walls are clearly brick, along with wood framing and steel roofing. Unsure of what this machine is here on the left, yet what we can decipher initially is that this building is substantially and clearly built of more formally treated materials. What does seem to be an anomaly, though, in this image in particular is the lack of any bricks being prepared to be laid. There's no piles of bricks, no mortar present, and really, not many workers to speak of at all. It would seem that an image such as this, showcasing an incomplete section of this building, would be full of activity. We really begin to fight with logic if we speculate as to why this may be the case. It would be hard to imagine that tens of thousands of workers would all take the same days off. Surely there would be some sort of rotation in the workforce to keep a consistent flow of work and progress. Suppose it could also be lunch, or maybe after hours. Surely no one worked overtime to complete this mammoth project within a 24-month period. Let's move on to another image here, quite similar to the first in a sense. We can see scaffolding around various areas of the building. Also, we can see some indications of molds or facades on the ground, some appearing white or lighter in color, while others appear darker. Is it possible that these are not painted yet? That is unknown. We have rail tracks along the side of the building for ease of moving of materials and also a train car. One detail that is anomalous is the corner section on the right of the image highlighted here. We have pillars here which are different in color than all other pillars within this image. Is it possible that these are awaiting a staff facade? What about the difference of window placement in this section? There are windows installed on the corner beside it, yet this section almost seems filled in, or possibly bricked in. It is hard to decipher with these images, unfortunately. What do you think about this one? Next, we have an image of the art building from afar, showing some construction. This image states that it is taken in March of 1892, and as you can see, there is still ice floating on the lagoon in front. Now we are going to pull at a thread for a minute, and then return to materials momentarily. As you view this image and a few others, I'm going to read a section regarding the construction during and after these cold winter months in Chicago. Among the many difficulties encountered by the construction department was the intensely cold and stormy weather, accompanied with heavy snowfalls, which marked the winter preceding the opening of the fair, one of the severest in the annals of Chicago. For weeks, the buildings were capped with snow and ice, the melting of which caused a severe strain on the roofs, crushing in portions and causing slight interior damage. Now, despite this record cold, we have mention of how well some of the infrastructure held up. So perfect was the attention to detail that nearly 300 hydrants used on the grounds, not one was rendered useless by frost. Let's continue with a section further on. A little before New Year occurred a thaw, which wrought most damage in the manufacturer's building, and the effects of which are thus described by one writing of the Lake City. Nothing could have withstood the tremendous power and weight of the snow. The corrugated sheeting of the gutter along the edge of the main roof curled up like paper and was carried in great strips to the roof of the annex below. The wooden supports of the skylights were broken and twisted in 1,000 shapes. Thousands of panes of glass were splintered. Great sections of the roof gave way and fell to the floor below. An hour after the first disastrous accident, another huge section of snow fell, crashing through the roof 200 or 300 feet south of the first break, and leaving an opening 50 feet in length. So great was the concussion that a plate of glass carried downward in the great mass of snow and splintered framework was embedded in the floor and stood upright, as though placed on edge by a glazier. By others, the damage was no less exaggerated, the cost of repairs for the roof of the manufacturer's building alone being variously estimated at from $25,000 to $100,000. Simply incredible, these details of the destruction of winter as a natural force. So let's read on. By another, the damaged areas was stated at 32,000 square feet, which could be replaced for 14 cents a foot, or $4,480 in all. About this time, it began to be noised abroad that to complete the buildings and their repairs and to install the exhibits by the 1st of May would be a task beyond the powers of the managers, said the Chicago correspondent of a leading San Francisco journal, writing from Jackson Park in February 1893. This seems to me an impossibility. Still, the cold-blooded fact stares one in the face that only the women's building is anywhere near completion, inside and out. The last section here is quite interesting as well and felt it worthy of mention. It reads as follows: to afford some faint conception as to the proportions of the fair, it may be stated that in the construction of the main buildings, there were used nearly 20,000 tons of iron and steel and 30,000 tons of staff, many thousand tons of glass, and about 70 million feet of lumber. For installing the exhibits, 25,000 men were required, and during the term of the exposition, it was estimated that including those in state and foreign buildings, 70,000 employees would be needed. 15,000 men were engaged in cleaning the grounds, in painting and making repairs, all contractors being required to complete their work as far as possible before the 1st of May. Well, where do we start with this one? This is the type of information, though, that we should expect. To put it bluntly, failures. The breakdown of buildings, services, and interiors due to unforeseen circumstances. What an absolute disaster indicated by this document regarding the manufacturer's building, to have endured one of the most severe winters to date in Chicago. However, it is certainly good news that almost all 300 hydrants were completely fine, due to the attention of detail, naturally. Is that what we saw in the last presentation of the underground services? We have to now factor in events such as this. Not only were these buildings completed, but massive sections needed to be repaired, huge holes in the roofs, glass falling that was so large it pierced the floor and stood upright, 32,000 square feet of flooring being replaced. Then we have some truly massive amounts of material being mentioned, 20,000 tons, not pounds, tons of iron for the main buildings, 30,000 tons of staff, many thousand tons of glass. Interesting how there is no specific number there. This detail always seems either unknown or mentioned vaguely in these building descriptions. The amount of glass used or required. 70 million feet of lumber. And I do wonder if that includes any mistakes or damaged areas like what was recently discussed. Alright, let's move on to our last document regarding these buildings, and it will be a summary of sorts. This section coming from a publication called Jackson's Famous Pictures, Columbian Expo. We have a few pages at the end of this book that contain short descriptions of the buildings and the materials used. Let's see what they say. The Administration Building. Material, 2,385,000 feet of lumber, 1,562,607 feet of structural steel. The Agricultural Building. Material in main building, 9.2 million feet of lumber, and 1,452,000 pounds of structural iron. In annex, 2 million feet of lumber. The Electricity Building. Material, 4.8 million feet of lumber, and 1,299,500 pounds of structural steel. The Fine Arts Building. Material, 13 million brick, 1,229,660 pounds of structural iron, 1,914 feet of lumber. This building was fireproof, although the construction was designed to be temporary. The walls were brick, the roof, floors, and galleries were of iron. The Fish and Fisheries Building. Material, 1,820,000 feet of lumber, 484,800 pounds of structural iron. The glass fronts of the aquaria were 575 feet in length and had 3,000 square feet of surface. The water capacity of the aquaria was 140,000 gallons. Saltwater fish were shown in tanks of 40,000 gallons. The Horticultural Building. The material, 1,895,000 feet of lumber, 1,181,488 pounds of iron. The Illinois Building. The material, 3 million feet of lumber. For iron, 1.3 million pounds. The Machinery Building. The material, 10,500,000 feet of lumber, 11 million pounds of structural steel. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building. The material, 16,750,000 feet of lumber, 13,145,000 pounds of steel in trusses of central hall, 2,211,000 pounds of iron in roof of nave. Additionally, another mention here, it says its unequaled size made it one of the architectural wonders of the world. The Mines and Mining Building. The material, 2,950,000 feet of lumber, and we have here 580,500 pounds of steel. Here's the transportation exhibits. The material, 2,640,000 feet of lumber with 1 million pounds of iron. Here's the United States Government Building, 4 million feet of lumber, while 1.8 million pounds of iron were used. The Women's Building. The material, 1,350,000 feet of lumber, 173,900 pounds of iron. Additionally, we have this last section under miscellaneous, and this will bleed into the next section of the presentation. So the building material, it states, in the erection of the exposition buildings, it is estimated 75 million feet of lumber were required. This represented 5,000 acres of standing trees. The structural iron and steel required was 20,000 tons. And now that we have a quick summary of most of the notable buildings and have seen a wide array of materials, let's explore some of those materials so we have a better understanding of what these summaries may mean. I would recommend doing your own research to confirm the following details, and it is always possible that I may have an incorrect perception of these methods. If you know more and have data to back it up, feel free to post in the comments below for further discussion. Let's begin with staff. We actually have a small section within a publication called The Best Things to Be Seen at the World's Fair. It reads as follows. The material used in the construction of the exposition buildings was iron, wood, glass, and what is called staff. 30,000 tons or 2,000 carloads of the latter material were consumed. Staff was invented in France about 1876 and first used in the buildings of the Paris Exposition. It is composed chiefly of powdered gypsum, the other constituents being alumnia, glycerin, and dextrin. These are mixed with water without heat and cast in molds in any desired shape and allowed to harden. The natural color is a murky white, but other colors are produced by external washes rather than by additional ingredients. To prevent brittleness, the material is cast around a coarse cloth, bagging, or oakum. The casts are shallow-like and about half an inch thick. They may be in any form, in imitation of cut stone, rock-faced stone, moldings, or the most delicate designs. For the lower portions of the walls, the material is mixed with cement, which makes it hard. Staff is impervious to water and is a permanent building material, although it costs less than 1/10 of that of marble or granite. A very interesting statement in the last sentence that mentions the permanency of this particular building material. Now, one detail that seemed to be a bit contradicting was another description of staff in the summary that we just looked at. It goes on to describe staff as well, except it states that staff has been used for more than 100 years as a covering for buildings, notably in South America. The amount of this work on the main exposition buildings is equal to the covering of one wall of a 4-story building 15 miles long. This was merely an interesting data point as it does not jive with the documentation we just read, stating that staff was invented only a few years prior in France for the Paris Exposition. Moving on to stucco, which was mentioned a few times, and its alternative technique of Scagliola. While researching this particular topic, I came across a presentation from Paul Cook, who had published a video about a year ago on this very topic. It was an interesting exploration into the idea of Scagliola in general, discussing how many of the ornate and incredibly beautiful features seen in older buildings may be of this substance rather than actual stone. I shared the same surprise as he did upon discovery of this material, as its appearance, once finished, is almost indistinguishable from actual stone. Using this method allows for some unique patterns and colors to be applied to various moldings, pillars, and other details that would traditionally be incredibly difficult to achieve with actual stone, if not impossible. So shout out to Paul Cook, and his video will be linked below should you be interested to watch that in addition to this presentation. Let's briefly go over these materials and discuss how they are made, applied, and what kind of result is to be expected once they are completed. We will do a brief overview of stucco, and an additional style of stucco which is Scagliola. Stucco is mainly 3 elements: lime, plaster, and pigment. The following process is geared towards producing Scagliola, and it is an older technique of mimicking stone. These elements are mixed together in varying quantities, which produces the desired effect. That could be a specific color or a marble-like quality that includes different colors or pigments. They are also mixed in specific proportions, and usually mixed by hand in order to maintain the specific color or pattern. Once it is in a malleable state, almost dough-like, It is then molded into layers, and then cut into slabs, and then placed on a surface to be spread and worked. Cutting multiple slices and filling out a sheet of stone-like material to create a realistic look. Once your sheet is complete, it could either be dried and prepped for a flat installation of a wall, for example. However, if we are looking to have this applied to a pillar, let's say, it must dry to a certain point, yet still be malleable enough to apply onto an exterior of a pillar. It is then applied and molded onto the surface, while filling in the gaps, spreading out inconsistent areas and ensuring a smooth and believable surface. Once it is dried, it is then sanded. Additionally, after that, it can be polished to give the final appearance of a glossy, stone-like finish. And once it is finished, the end result is absolutely incredible and completely altered my perception of what we may be looking at within this older imagery. When we see what appears to be marble pillars, grand stone walls, or carved intricate ornate details, it may simply be Scagliola. So, what does this mean? It means an incredible amount of discernment is required when viewing imagery of older buildings in general. There are those that will simply claim that certain details are marble, or granite, or onyx, or any type of difficult stone to quarry and move. Yet it cannot be known unless these buildings or areas are visited firsthand and investigated. I find alternative theories absolutely fascinating, and honestly, quite possible in many cases. Yet I want to get to those conclusions with reasonable data, with objective information, along with logic or rational thinking. This is why it is in my best interest to present these findings as such. Findings, limiting any bias so that you can decide for yourself, and also add perspective which I may not have. The more data points we can collectively contribute will certainly be a much more beneficial way to get to some semblance of truth or understanding. Okay, back on track here. Now, as mentioned, this is a durable material in a sense, quite similar to staff in many ways, as stucco or scagliola is essentially a thin cement-like veneer that is applied to a surface for protection, or in this case added cosmetic appearance. After reviewing this, it bolstered the evidence of the many notes we read that indicated some details of the buildings looking like a particular stone, appearing like marble, imitation onyx, or likeness of granite. Now, do we know for sure? Absolutely not. It could very well be the case that some of these details were indeed the specified stone. Yet we have no ability to confirm this, as 99% of these buildings have been disappeared. We cannot investigate these aspects in person, which is truly unfortunate. Okay, so now that we have a very basic understanding of these materials, let's go over some questions here. Staff would have been used for larger areas of the buildings, and then painted over using a new technique which was conveniently invented during this time. It is a curious detail and could be considered a strange coincidence. However, inventions usually come about under intense situations or timelines, or warfare. That seems to always push advancement of technologies, not necessarily for the better, but advancement nonetheless. Stucco and scagliola would have been used for more decorative elements that they wanted to have imitate actual stone. Stucco could also have the same application as staff and be applied to the exterior of buildings for protection from the environment. It could also be colored with pigment for a desired effect. So staff being applied to most, if not all, buildings. This is usually the data point of many who state the fair was temporary. It was all wood and staff. Everything was molded and applied to the exterior of wood frames. This is certainly what we can assume from many of the images that we are given. Yet much of the imagery, as we have seen, is manipulated. Some is clearly benign. Yes, and I have stated this in previous episodes. Not all manipulation would have malicious intent, yet it is an aspect to keep present when viewing historic imagery in general. So let's say that the imagery surrounding this event are clues rather than direct evidences or proofs. They are not guarantees of anything. In saying that, let's start grilling this thing. We have a lot of imagery, especially from Charles Arnold's collection, that shows various statues being worked on. Yet where is the imagery showing this type of work anywhere on the grounds? For those of you familiar with this event and much of the imagery surrounding it, where are these materials shown? There are a few images showing what appear to be molds and in some cases thrown about randomly, which seems entirely out of place. Yet these should be everywhere. Literally everywhere. There should be molds of pillars, of balustrades, of ornamental details, of pillar cappings, of inlays, etc. There are no images of these pieces being installed, no images of these statues being placed, no images of any on-site mixing. What about the staff or scagliola or stucco being applied? We do not have one single image of this process being done. There is no indication of this material even being applied. There should be remnants of this stuff lying around, or at the very least seeing workers applying it. There were only a few thousand completing this type of work after all. And if somehow all these materials were completed beforehand in a single workshop, which appears to be the case, why do we not have images of these materials being transported? Where in these images of the workshop are the hundreds of molds for crowning, inlays, ceilings, window details? Would there not be images of these elements being readied or mixed, being transported, being refined, getting shaped, using molds being applied to the building exteriors, images showing large containers on the construction sites? The workers should be covered in this stuff at this point in the construction phase. Plus, it would be all over the construction sites. Now, is this too critical for this specific documentation? We do have evidences of wood around much of the construction sites, along with steel. We do see various stages of construction with both of these materials. We don't have many, if any, that show the actual installation of wood panels or steel beams, of glass windows, or of people actually just working, which is such a curious detail. We don't have any imagery showing the bricks being built up for the art building. So are we just going around in circles here, as we don't really have a lot of evidences one way or the other? And what I am specifically talking about in this instance is the act of construction. Yes, we have many images of somewhat completed buildings, or buildings with scaffolding surrounding it. Yet where are the images of someone carrying a plank, installing a floorboard, measuring, framing, hammering, delivering materials, leveling, finishing, etc.? I'm sure you understand the point here. These are details that are anomalous. Yet again, maybe this is too critical. Additionally, could you mix these ingredients in large quantities? There are instances where this could be possible, yet it seems more plausible for a plain staff mixture. However, if you require someone to handcraft the veins and every aspect of the imitation rock or substance you're artistically rendering, that's actually quite a massive undertaking. This would require a force of many to continually craft, refine, and then apply this material. This is an art form, and is also a logistically mind-boggling endeavor. Surely this technique would be more widely known a century ago, with more talented and capable workers to accomplish it, yet it still requires artistry. And let's be honest, even mixing a simple batch of saccharine requires some skill of alchemical combination, and there's only 2 ingredients. Now, speaking of ingredients, we did have mention earlier of tons of staff being transported, yet that really doesn't define anything and simply fits in with the other vague mentions of feet of lumber or pounds of steel. Where is the mention of the transportation of lime, of plaster, and what about pigments? What about the storage of these materials? We have no mention of the ingredients used in these techniques arriving at the site, being mixed on site, being applied on site. As mentioned before, there is no visual evidences of this either. We have these strange images that show completed pillar tops, or intricate moldings, statues, and other pieces, yet not one image of them being installed. As an official photographer for this event, would that not be on the bucket list for documentation? The application of this finishing, the adornment of these massive statues on top of these structures. What about the completion of the statue of Columbia and the final stages of it being finished? When it comes to these supposed temporary materials, there are just as many questions that need answering. There are almost more questions, in a sense, because this is the narrative that is currently being supported. Understandably, you can't capture everything, and Charles Arnold is only one man, at least that we know of. Yet, no one captured the above scenes, the above question marks. No one photographed a batch of Scagliola being mixed, formed, and applied. No one captured the moment a massive staff pediment being adorned with a beautifully crafted staff molding of artwork. Ceiling inlays were not captured. Not even an image of a stucco mixture being applied to an exterior of a building. It is incredibly curious how we had mentioned earlier of how the interiors of these buildings surpassed the exterior in beauty and wonderment. Yet we don't have much evidence for interior construction, or finishing, let's say. What about the weather or environment in which it is being mixed? How do these materials fare in cooler weather? Can they be mixed or used in frigid temperatures? What we have here are seemingly more questions. Additionally, the idea that staff, stucco, and scagliola were incredibly simple. Are these methods simple compared to masonry, brickwork, and carving stone? Sure. However, these techniques require some method of alchemical mixing, molding, and application. In many cases, this is artistry. This is a skill. And there is the added factor of time. Some of these techniques require time for it to set to a certain state in order to be manipulated into desired forms. No amount of money will expedite circumstances such as this. If someone offered an additional sum of money in order to have a concrete foundation dry in 10 minutes, it simply can't be done. Some things require time to set. Is this time accounted for within this specific event? Are any of these questions easily answered with the evidence surrounding this event? That is, of course, up for you to decide. This next segment will be a wider set of imagery, which will include buildings and other possible indications of notable materials or anomalous features. Most of these images are from Shep's World's Fair photographed. This will be a quicker section as this is merely to highlight any type of material for data points, temporary or durable. Our first building is the Venezuela building, and it notes here, this republic is represented by a one-storied building constructed of imitation marble with decorations in green and gold. As for the image itself, there were a few elements to point out. One being the strong edges on the building in the upper right of the image, appearing masked, and even comparing the left and right side of the building itself, the left being quite rigid and clean, while the right has a bit of blurring or feathering applied. Additionally, the dome above this building, whether it is part of this structure or something behind it, there is an illustrative effect to it. This statue here may also be illustrated over or completely illustrated into the image. Next is the Turkish building, with the following note. The building is very odd and is made after the style of a fountain. It is dark wood, the exterior carving done by artists of Damascus, Syria. Some notes with this image. The foundation is interesting as it appears to be stonework, yet it is also illustrated. We can see some more illustrated elements in the signage above the door as it is quite bright, and even towards the left of the image, the lettering appears to rise up and even interferes with the leaves. You can clearly see the dark outlines that go over the leaves, or at least are incredibly close, so they have been highlighted to create a distinction between the two elements, the typography and the leaves. Above the building, we can see this almost white fog, which may be linked to masking and may also be linked to a tool digital artists use called burn and dodge, essentially creating artificial highlights or dark areas within the image. This was also a technique used in darkrooms while developing photography, and was obviously more tangible and will be explored more in future episodes. This could be to simply accentuate different details and be purely cosmetic, or it could be used to hide physical cuts and negatives that may have been used in the creation of composite images. That is up to you to decide, of course. Moving on to the Swedish building, we have a few notes from Shep's photographs and a few from the World's Fair album. Respectively, let's begin here. Looking at it from the front, the visitor would be apt to regard it more as a fortress than a church, as the sides of the main entrance represent Don John keeps, and the towers are anything but belfries. The sides of the building are of dark wood, with Gothic gables and antique windows. Among the exhibits is a saw said to be the largest band saw in the world. The largest hot-rolled steel band in the world is also here. It would be impossible to describe the iron treasures of this great building, consisting as they do of objects almost microscopically small and implements massive as anchors. The image that accompanies this description has a few elements worth mention. There's something a bit strange happening with the main front window, just here. Unsure if this has been brushed over with a light paint or ink, but there's a distinct tonal difference and a rounded shape on the window, while the area above appears to be closer to the actual image or original image. Next is the indication of the fire hydrant, and merely pointing this out as another data point from the last episode of infrastructure. Speaking of those types of details, is it not strange that these lamp posts do not have any glass elements in them? That is slightly curious. Also, we can see how the turrets of this building, and the first floor in general, is largely comprised of brick, Something to take note of is the spiral pattern of brickwork on the upper portion of those turrets. Additionally, we have this description that indicates the building was temporarily put together and afterward sent to this country in pieces. The lower part of the front wall is composed of brick, terracotta, and cement of Swedish importation, and the rest of the structure is of wood covered with shingles. Now, let's briefly look at the image accompanying this description. I'm sure many of you who have an eye for some of these details can spot a few artistic markings. First, let's tackle the main manipulation, and that is the masking of this image, indicated by the hard lines through the trees along the horizon. We can see that this specific set of buildings and elements have been separated from any background elements beyond those trees. This may simply be done to emphasize the building being described. Again, this editing may be entirely benign, yet it is an aspect that is present, and imagery must be inspected with a critical eye to determine if this type of editing was purely cosmetic or has other means that may be determined to a specific narrative. There are buildings such as this one on the right that have many black strokes applied to it, potentially to add definition to an already bright image. There are darker strokes applied to many areas of the Swedish building to add definition. We can also clearly see that there is a distinction of color in the bricks on the corner sections, which was not as apparent as in the previous image. Additionally, we can see some painting or blurring of the tree leaves, here specifically on the right as well as front and center. You can see where the paint or brushing has been applied, while the original image still remains and has more definition. Some of the people are also illustrated over or completely drawn in. Many highlights applied over the main Swedish building also. There are many more elements that have been edited, but we do need to move on to more images. So yet another image of the Swedish building with an indication of bricked towers or turrets. We have many similar elements as in the previous images. Highlights on the exterior of signage, highlighted railings, and window frames. And speaking of windows, there is one pane missing on the top left here. Maybe it's open, unsure. People are either illustrated over or completely illustrated. Additionally, more hard edges around the building as if it has been removed from the background. So moving on to our next structure, which is the Spanish building, which has a brief note reading as follows. Her pavilion is superb. The portal is supported by marble pillars. And moving on to the image itself, this one was quite interesting actually. Initially we see the exterior of the building appears as some sort of stonework, yet it cannot be confirmed and it could very well be modeled to appear as stone using staff as mentioned before. The most notable details seem to be the indication of a curb that would be found on the streets of a modern city, of the time that is. There is also what looks like a sidewalk on the right of the image near this group of people. Now, do we know exactly what these materials may be comprised of? Unfortunately, not. The sidewalk area could be crushed gravel that is simply well manicured, and maybe the curb could be fashioned from something more temporary. That is unknown. Overall, it is very curious, as there was no mention of creating real streets, including curbs, walkways, and connecting stairways to buildings, unless we refer back to our original plans, which state that many features would be comprised of formally treated materials. Our next image is of the Germany building. We have an image and a few notes that read as follows. Her building is a composite structure with an odd mingling of ancient and modern architectural forms. It is of stone, wood, and staff. The exterior is painted with wreaths, scrolls, and fanciful figures. The base of the building is of gray stone, while the upper verandas are of some rich dark wood. And in the central tower, there is a clock with a chime of bells. The largest weighs 8,000 pounds, the next 5,000, the smallest 3,000. So looking at this image of the Germany building, we can see that it is situated right beside the Spanish building, and therefore also has this curb in front of the building. Now let's put this into some perspective here as we look at another image. So as we can see, we have the Germany building in the distance, and the French building is the closest building on the right. Let's briefly look at an image from the official views of the Columbian Exposition showing the French building. There's an indication here that the curb we saw at the Spanish and Germany building has continued along the shoreline and ends roughly here at the French building. Going back to the previous image now, we can see another detail, which is the bricked shoreline. Not only that, we can see that the shore is bricked. Then there is a paved section, and then on the other side of the paved pathway is another lined section of brick. Now, do we know for sure it is paved? I suppose we do not. However, we did have an indication in the initial plans that this was the plan all along, to pave along the shoreline. So let's discuss roughly how large this brick shoreline was, along with the paved walkway and accompanying road, a road that also has curbs running along large sections of it. We begin by looking at a few images sourced from the Library of Congress and Charles Arnold, as these images show where exactly our previous explorations ended. The bricked shoreline ran along the manufacturer's building and up towards the naval exhibit. However, let's look at a map and see how extensive this was. Using the Union News Company's map of the exposition and the scale that indicates roughly 1,000 feet, we begin to measure. Now this is rough, obviously, yet it equals about 5,000 feet of bricked shoreline. This is quite incredible, but there is a major question that comes forward, and it relates to the earlier exploration of this bricked shoreline. The image in Campbell's Illustrated History stated that this specific image showing the shoreline was before the fair. So do we have a major discrepancy here? Do we have approximately 5,000 feet of bricked shoreline that was there before the work began on the fair? And why was this not mentioned in the initial construction notes? There was no mention of the shoreline being worked to have bricks installed, or any mention of it being there and would not require any working. So is there something here? Is this a true discrepancy? Suppose that is another one for you to decide. Let's continue on to our next building here, which is the Ceylon building. We have a quick note here of some materials. The building in which Ceylon has stored her treasures is of dark wood, surmounted by a dome sustained by richly carved pillars, and has two wings covered with a profusion of carving. It is constructed of 22 different kinds of wood, of which Ceylon produces 200 varieties. Now, moving on to the next building, which is the Wisconsin building, and its corresponding note reads as follows. The base of the structure is brown stone from the Lake Superior regions. It is in huge wrought solid blocks. Above, it is of pressed brick, while the shingles are from the northern forests of the state. It has a greater look of solidity than any of the buildings made of staff. This description was quite interesting, as we have a direct indication of formerly treated materials, along with a mention of how different it looks from the buildings made from staff. Let's also add a note here from another publication called the World's Fair Album, with a description that reads as follows. The walls of the lower story are of Lake Superior brown stone and Menominee red pressed brick, and above that the exterior finish is chiefly in native dimension shingles. Massive brownstone pillars and polished granite columns support the front and rear porches. Certainly some interesting details. Now the Washington Building is next, and there are a couple notes here. Let's start off with this one. The lower story is built of logs dressed only on one side. They are giants of their kind, those in the lower tier being 120 feet long and 4 feet thick. One of the special features of the building is the main entrance, which is of granite, marble, and ore quarried in the state. Moving on, we're going to take a look at the Vermont Building. An interesting building for sure, as it is unique. There's nothing like it on the fairgrounds, probably not in the world at present time. Passing under a carved portal, we enter a paved courtyard. The floors of the courtyard and the pavilion are of marble from quarries in Rutland, Vermont. The fountain and basin are also of stone quarried in the state. Entering, we find ourselves in a circular chamber floored with marble. The marble of which all floors are made is especially noticeable. Thousands of the men of Vermont are engaged in quarrying. In fact, it is one of the chief industries of the state. Much of this stone is used for monumental purposes. It is so fine and may be so beautifully polished. Our next building is South Dakota. We begin with this section that reads as follows. Polished sandstone and jasper are arranged in semicircular forms over the main portal. The pillars are of very highly polished stone and give a beautiful effect to the building. Additionally, we have some mention of exhibits. Now, this is a small tangent from materials, yet found it incredibly interesting. To our right, a large number of petrifactions are on view, many of them being whole sections of trees, the largest about 3 feet in diameter. The wood has become agatized and is very rich in color. There are also a great variety of fossils in this building, many of them antediluvian animals of mammoth proportion. South Dakota appears to be rich in these ancient remains. Now, speaking of South Dakota being rich in ancient remains, or America in general, if you have any interest in this thread of information, please take a moment to check out The Archivist with Analog on YouTube. The body of work that Ben has amassed from various newspaper articles, stories, and clippings is truly astounding. His Ancient America series was packed full of stories ranging from fossilized forests, underground cave explorations, discoveries of large bone structures, ancient cities and ruins, lost canals, and much more. The writing of these articles in many ways is so artistically well done too. Very much an elegant capture of your attention to guide you through an adventure of these mysterious discoveries. It's so good. Anyways, if you have any interest in that type of work, please check him out. You will not be disappointed. The link to his channel will be below. Before moving on to our next building, it is interesting viewing the image of this building and the clearly illustrated markings outlining what looks like stonework or masonry on the lower levels of this building. Again, this is basically speculation. Yet would it surprise you at this point, considering the materials already mentioned, that this also may be some sort of stone? Up to you, of course. New York is next with their building, and the note of interest reads as follows. The New York building is almost the best state structure erected. Work did not commence upon it till March 1893, but it was pushed along briskly. A noticeable feature of the architecture consists of 3 great pillars which support the roof. They are made of 9 trees cut down in the Adirondacks and twisted together into 3, causing a very novel effect. So, looking at this image, this building was started only 2 months before the opening of the event. It may not have been finished before it started, and definitely not saying it would be impossible. It is just an interesting data point in the timeline of this event. So let's examine a few notable details. The first is this wire-like white line, or lines, that are around this perimeter fence. Not exactly sure what this is, as there are a few anomalies here. Just a bit strange, as they don't seem to be associated with any element. Next is the infrastructure details, the fire hydrant and the electrical lights. Not that there is anything strange or unusual, just to keep the idea of underground services in mind. Additionally is some of the foliage, landscaping, or plants. This will be another exploration, but try to keep this detail in mind also. There seems to be an abundance of potted plants on the front entrance, and it does look like they are in the midst of some landscaping. But what about the trees? Are they also transplanted here? Those in construction or engineering or landscaping? I mean, you tell me, would these trees be kept in this close proximity while the building is being constructed? Take note of how every tree except the one on the left has been pruned in some way, which is a bizarre detail. Looking on the left now of the building, we can see that the foundation of this rounded area appears like large stonework. Again, considering all that we have heard and referenced, this isn't out of the realm of possibility. What is a bit strange is that there is a discoloration of this apparent stonework. And is that because it's being painted? And is that what these men are doing here? The last detail of note is to the left here, just where there is a tonal smudge. Looking closely, you can see that there's a difference in color, and it almost appears to be brushed over. There's no detail in the bottom of the trees in the distance, and this one in front of the darker building has no bottom half of its trunk. It's just floating because of these brush marks. You can see portions of this building in the back that have been illustrated. There is even a darker stroke on the New York building's foundation to differentiate from these brush strokes. Unsure of what this may be fixing or potentially covering up. Moving on to our next building, which is Massachusetts. A couple of notes here, and the first one reads, "The exterior has an appearance of gray stone, and the windows are of old-fashioned order, with green jalousies or blinds. The approach by broad stone steps which lead up to a wide piazza." This description states that this building held many antique pieces of furniture and other relics, and felt this sentence was an interesting one. The Massachusetts Committee must have ransacked the state pretty thoroughly to secure so many examples of antique house goods. Adding some data here is another mention of this building in the World's Fair album, where it reads as follows. "The exterior is finished in staff, in imitation of cut granite, but the unique interior is of more durable construction." Let's continue on with the next building here, which is representing Maine. Let's go over a few details, starting with, it is a very oddly built structure, but presents a neat appearance. The lower story is built of various kinds of granite, in which the state is very rich. To the uninformed, the various colors and graining, the delicate veining and tracery of this story are a pleasing revelation, while the different methods of treatment shown in the work form an excellent lesson in the dressing of such material. Most of the large quarries of the state have contributed toward this part of the building. The roof is slated with beautiful material from the Monson quarries. Passing into the building between beautiful pillars of polished granite, we find ourselves beneath the rotunda, which rises to a height of nearly 80 feet. A truly interesting building. Our next building of note is the Iowa building, which has a brief mention reading as follows. It is made of a steel framework into which much glass is set. Moving on from there, our next building is the Indiana structure, with a couple of notes. The first one stating, the edifice is quite imposing, having a series of red Gothic towers, which rise above the gray walls of staff, greatly heightening the effect. Additionally, there was another note in here related to materials and felt it noteworthy. It reads as follows. There is a very curious souvenir of the quarries of the state, consisting of a life-size figure of an elephant carved out of a single solid block of stone. So the first thought while looking at the image of this building is, how did they manage to get that solid block of a literal elephant into this building? Maybe they built the house around it? And additionally, just why? It is yet another detail that stirs the imagination for sure. A couple more notes. We can see a fire hydrant here at the left of the image. Also, this lamppost seems to be missing another glass element, which is a bit bizarre. The next stop is the Idaho building, with a brief note about an abundant resource within the state, being mica. It reads as follows. Mica then enters largely into the ornamentation of the building. It has a large mica hall, some of the sheets used being 12 by 20 inches, and as clear as glass. The windows, panels, wainscoting, and other parts are made of ore. Moving on to our next building, being from West Virginia, this description and image sourced from the World's Fair album. The note of mention reads, the ceilings are of ornamental ironwork from Wheeling, West Virginia, and all the exterior is built of material from that state. A very vague mention of material used for the exterior. While viewing the image, it does appear like the foundation is of more formally treated materials. However, that is mere speculation. Let's explore the Nebraska State Building. We have a note here that indicates the following. The house measures 100 by 60 feet and is constructed of staff treated to represent stone. Now, after researching and reading through many of these descriptions, it was curious that this one stated the building was constructed of staff. In many previous descriptions, we read that this material was applied to a pre-existing structure. It was not necessarily built from staff. The staff was applied and then molded. Maybe this is a minor detail to get hung up on, yet it seemed a bit strange, is all. Our next building is from California. There are materials noted, and it reads as follows. Even the material used in its construction, adobe or sun-dried brick, is similar to what was used in those old days of romance. A very interesting detail indeed. The image that accompanies this description also has its fair share of illustrated elements, many of which you won't need my input to find. Some of them, though, are just ruthless. I mean, look at what our retoucher did to this poor palm tree. I mean, what about the highlights on these tree branches on the left? It almost seems that they were in a paint by numbers mode and just filling in major details throughout this image. Let's move on to our next structure, which is the Colorado Building, built in the Spanish Renaissance type, naturally. We have a note of mention here that reads as follows. The interior fittings of native marble and onyx were well worth seeing, and showed the richness of the centennial state in these materials. With this description, it is unclear if these fittings are related to the building itself or maybe they are part of an exhibit. Felt that it was worth mentioning either way. Now, briefly looking at this image, it seems clear that we may have the same retoucher as the last image. The trees on the left side of the image are highlighted and look blatantly strange, as the trunks are all white. Yet all the branches are just a black mass with 0 highlights. The trees on the right side along the path have also been highlighted or shaded, and in this case here, our retoucher just cut this poor tree right off. Didn't even care to fix it either. Absolutely ruthless. And with that, I'll end this segment here. There are a few more images that we will go through as they represent visual anomalies or present what appear to be more durable materials. This next selection of images relates to an exhibit that was present on the midway of the Columbian Exposition. The specific exhibit being the streets of Cairo, where an assortment of events, characters, and shops were on display for the fair goers. As the images scroll through, take note of the groundwork, which appears to be all brick. You can see some of the finer details of this brickwork on closer framed images, and take note of how this brickwork, if that is indeed what it is, interacts with the surrounding buildings. Take note of the buildings themselves too, and the potential building materials. Surely, much of the midway would have been constructed. However, considering what we have already read and seen through this presentation, it would not be surprising to see more durable materials, would it? Additionally, we have these strange mentions that have been discussed before, such as parapets or parapets, which are usually made or found within fortifications and made of durable materials. So why would this specific term be used when referring to fountains? What about these strange walls that appear to be made of substantial stone blocks that run along the shoreline in some areas at this event? Seemingly so out of place and completely unusual for this event. Additionally, this mention of an incredibly large exhibit that was set up inside the manufacturer's building that was labeled as the Moorish Arcade from Spain. It indicates that its dainty marble columns are uniquely designed. So is this actual stone? Actual marble? Or is this imitation? Surely if it was not real, it would be stated, as with many previous descriptions. How about a brief look into the government building in the main rotunda area? Despite the illustrative elements in the upper portions of the image, we can see that this area is finely decorated, intricately designed, and whether this is from durable materials or not, this still stirs the mind and begs the question of how all of this was completed within the time frame given. The peristyle is next here, and this is quite interesting, as this runs along the beach area or shoreline, an area that was mentioned earlier to have been bricked, and we have multiple images showing this aspect. Yet, there are these curious images that depict the floor of this area was brick, A truly interesting detail as we keep coming across these instances of contradictions. Only in the sense of what is currently said about this event, however, because if we go back to the original plans that have been referenced before in this episode and in previous, it does mention that pathways were to be made of formerly treated materials. Yet another interesting detail here, and it was this one building that seemed to fit the bill of the term temporary, and it could be shown at least with the imagery surrounding the event. This one is curious. Let's start off with an image from Campbell's Illustrated History. The building in question is on the far right, and unfortunately bleeds off the right side here. Now, before moving on to further images, notice how the house is, let's say, not square. Our retoucher must have forgot their ruler for this particular image. The roof is off, the windows are crooked, and this wall in particular is straight up janky. The reflection of this house is questionable also. Hard to tell if from this perspective we would see that much of the house considering how far back it is from the water. Now, if you thought the house was in poor shape, look at the absolute monstrosity of materials that were used here. There isn't one straight line on this side of the structure to speak of. Now, these structures are there, and these are most likely just illustrated over. Yet this is sloppy. It's just bad. Anyways, this is beside the point. Moving on to this image from the same publication, we can see the same structures in the background. And the building in question that we saw in the last image is actually a hotel. We can also see the same idea from this image being from a publication called The Century World's Fair Book for Boys and Girls. This building is out of place. Why? Because it is directly in the footprint of the music hall, which can be seen in many images of the completed buildings that focus around the basin. And even if it is slightly out of the way, somehow, why would a hotel, most likely for the workers, be built here? Of all places, right here. It would seem highly unlikely that this building may have been retrofitted, or at least some of it, to become the music hall, considering what this building looked like when it was finished. So, does this mean that this building was built, then removed, and another more impressive building was built on top of that original footprint? This is a weird one here, one that I don't understand at all. Again, think of the infrastructure from our previous episode. What would have been required to do this? And why? Why would this structure be built here? Anyways, yet another anomaly for you to think on. Overall, it seems that there is not a clear and decisive answer as to which materials were used within this event. There is no definitive material. We have a range from each end of the spectrum that was initially proposed in the introduction, and this is specifically why it was worded as wood, staff, and plaster, or iron, brick, and stone, because they are both seemingly true and include materials from both ends of the spectrum. Sometimes when these theories are tested, it is not merely black and white. They can include some from each side, and the truth may be somewhere in the middle. What this brief exploration has provided is some idea of how gray this event truly is. It was not all wood and staff, and it is definitely not all granite, marble, and blockwork. However, there is indication of both, and many more materials in between. Additionally, the many anomalous images that indicate more formally treated materials. Of course, we cannot know for sure as there is virtually no evidence left of this event. A curious detail from this presentation is that we have many mentions of more durable materials represented in the state buildings or other exhibit buildings from around the grounds. There's also very little documentation of the construction of these structures. Please remember too, even though this presentation was one of the longest thus far, it is merely scratching the surface. There are many publications with various descriptions on these buildings. I simply tried to highlight as many as possible, including any and all details regarding materials. So, what kind of conclusions can we make of these data points? Do these details align with the time frame given? Do we have more questions than answers? As usual, I will leave you with something to ponder, and there may be some extras after this you won't want to miss, so stay tuned. This first section is from a publication called The Book of the Fair, and it reads as follows. While the buildings were in process of construction, one could almost realize the colossal proportions of this enterprise. Entering the grounds in the spring of 1892, the visitor beheld such a scene of bustling activity as that which at the founding of Carthage greeted the father of the Roman race when he first set foot on Punic shores. And yet it was a silent activity that pervaded this group of mammoth structures, whose pillars and walls and domes were rising around him. Here was an army of mechanics, with hammer and saw and mallet, all plying their tools with the vigor of a true American workman. But amid the wide spaces that separated these huge architectural efforts, the noise was barely perceptible. Then there was an air of unreality about this congregation of edifices, so strange in dimensions and design, rising as from the touch of a fairy's wand at the bidding of some potent agency. On one hand might be seen the two sections of an immense iron arch, meeting as silently as shadows flitting earthward the sky. On another a pillar of stucco, the height of a 2-story house, being hoisted into air by a wire rope and placed in position by a couple of men 200 feet above the ground. And now, onto some extras. During this exploration, I found a section labeled Unidentified Projects in the Ryerson and Burnham archives. There was only a handful, and this first set is not related to the fair, yet felt they could be beneficial to this research in general. So let's take a look. This first image is quite interesting, so let's get some details sorted here. The title of this image was as stated, Unidentified Project. However, there is an alternative title, and it reads as Lincoln Park, South Lagoon. Yet there is a question mark at the end. Reading further, we have some notes which read as follows. Possibly construction of the South Lagoon in Lincoln Park, 1887. So let's take a brief look at where this area is in Chicago. It is a bit further north and closer to the downtown core of the city. Now getting back to this image, take note of the wall here, and notice how this isn't just dirt. This is block work. And look here above this crane at how some of these stones are completely broken up. So what exactly is happening in this image? Well, let's move this one to the side and take a look at another image, also in this same file, under the umbrella of Unidentified Projects. Alright, I'll leave these up side by side and add a few details. Those details simply being that they also have the exact same notes, same alternate title, same area, same time frame, and same location. take a look at the brickwork that almost seems identical in each image. And notice at how incredibly beat up it is in the second image. Now, this may be a stretch, yet the second image clearly shows how deep this canal goes, if that is indeed what it is, a canal. Is this brickwork at the very bottom here? And if so, why is it in better shape than the brickwork on top? Is this the proper way to construct something of this nature? Actually, let's just get to the big question here. Are we looking at construction, or is this excavation? Now, consider the notes and titles of these previous images, because this next image seems to be a curious addition to this exploration as a whole. So what exactly are we looking at here? I didn't think this was anything at first and almost skipped to the next image thinking this was merely a random image of a quarry or an industrial gravel yard of some sort. However, reading the note accompanying this image spun my imagination into overdrive. So let's see what you think. You ready for this one? Possibly construction at World's Columbian Exposition. Now, what are we to make of this description? This image could have been labeled anything else, yet that was the note. Additionally, it's probably pretty safe to say that this is not construction. These are bizarre images, anomalous images, unidentified images. I'm sure those have stirred the imagination a bit, and with that is the end of this presentation. I'd like to thank you for your time and hope that this provided a new perspective into the Columbian Exposition of 1893. It may not have provided sound answers and has seemingly opened up more avenues of questions, more threads to pull, and other lines of research to follow. If you enjoyed this one, give it a like. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more about the manipulation of historical documents, consider subscribing and learning about it with me.